Dawn breaks on July 31st, 1942. Soviet artillery opens fire at 0515, a 30-minute barrage targeting specific coordinates radioed back by forward reconnaissance elements during the night. The shells fall not on empty trenches but on German command posts, ammunition dumps, and the precise locations where the 256th Infantry Division's reserve companies assembled in darkness. When the barrage lifts, the mobile group, 9 tank brigades consolidated under 30th Army Command, resumes its southward drive toward Rzhev. This time, something is different. If you're interested in how wars are actually decided, by logistics, math, and doctrine, subscribe now, turn on notifications, and stay tuned for more in-depth World War II analysis. Let's continue. The T-34 mediums advance in company columns rather than broad assault waves, exploiting the narrow penetration corridors opened the previous day. At 0640, a battalion of tanks encounters the fortified hamlet of Polonino, a strong point anchoring the junction between 2 German regimental sectors. Rather than assault it directly, the mistake of 100 previous Soviet offensives, the armor bypasses it to the east. By 0720, 3 more bypassed strongpoints report enemy armor in their rear areas. The 256th Infantry Division's telephone network, strung along communication trenches now behind Soviet lines, begins failing as cables are crushed under tank tracks. The carefully constructed defensive system that had absorbed yesterday's assault is being systematically dismembered. At 0815, the divisional commander requests permission to withdraw his forward battalions to secondary positions 2 kilometers south. 9th Army Headquarters denies the request. Model's doctrine prohibits elastic defense. Every meter must be held. But at 0900 hours, Soviet tanks appear on the reverse slopes of Hill 224, firing directly into German artillery positions that had been sighted to fire northward. The gunners abandon 4 105mm howitzers. The guns are intact but useless. Their trails are positioned for bombardment, not direct fire defense. The breakthrough occurs not as dramatic collapse but as systemic failure. By 10:30, 3 battalion commanders within the 256th Infantry Division report loss of contact with adjacent units. Strongpoints designed for mutual support find themselves isolated, each fighting independently without knowledge of what's happening on their flanks. A regiment holding a 2-kilometer frontage fractures into 9 separate defensive positions. At 11:45, a motorcycle courier reaches divisional headquarters with authorization for limited withdrawal. But the order arrives 90 minutes after forward companies, facing encirclement, began pulling back on their own initiative. By 1300 hours on July 31st, the first German defensive line no longer exists as a continuous belt. Soviet reconnaissance units report open terrain ahead. The breakthrough force drives south, leaving German survivors in fortified villages to be reduced by following rifle divisions. The 256th Infantry Division, which began the day with defensive coherence, ends it as dispersed battle groups fighting delaying actions across 6 kilometers of depth. The path to Rzhev's northern approaches stands open. What follows over the next 10 days will determine whether the salient survives. On August 3rd, the fighting coalesced around a nondescript elevation northeast of Rzhev, designated Hill 200. The high ground commanded observation of the Vazuza River crossings and German supply routes feeding the salient. Whoever held it controlled the approaches. Soviet 20th Army committed 2 rifle divisions to seize the position at dawn, their assault groups advancing under artillery preparation from 76mm divisional guns and 122mm howitzers. The initial attack achieved tactical surprise. By 0800 hours, lead elements of the 251st Rifle Division had cleared German forward positions on the eastern slope, eliminating observation posts that had directed artillery fire across the river valley. Soviet troops dug in along the crest, establishing machine gun nests and bringing forward 45mm anti-tank guns to cover the approaches. For 3 hours, Hill 200 flew the red banner. The German response materialized with characteristic speed. Elements of the 1st Panzer Division, held in reserve 6 kilometers west, received orders to retake the height before Soviet forces could consolidate. 4 Panzer IV tanks led the counterattack. These were the newer AUSF. F-2 variants, mounting the long 75mm gun that could engage Soviet armor at ranges the T-34 couldn't match. By 1300 hours, German infantry from the 1st Panzer Division's motorized regiment reached the base of Hill 200 under covering fire from the Panzers. The assault climbed the western slope in squad rushes, supported by direct fire from 88mm flak guns positioned 800 meters to the rear. These dual-purpose weapons proved devastatingly effective, their high-velocity rounds collapsing Soviet field fortifications and destroying 2 anti-tank guns with direct hits. The Soviet garrison held for 90 minutes of close combat. German pioneers cleared the summit bunkers with satchel charges and flamethrowers. By 1530 hours, Hill 200 returned to German control. The cost: an estimated 340 Soviet casualties against 180 German. This tactical pattern, Soviet forces seizing ground through weight of numbers, German counterattacks reclaiming positions through superior firepower and coordination, would repeat across the Rzhev salient for the next 6 weeks. It represented the fundamental asymmetry of the Eastern Front in 1942. The Soviets could generate more men, more tanks, more guns, but the Germans could concentrate their smaller forces more effectively and respond to threats with greater speed and precision. Hill 200 changed hands 3 more times before August 10th. Each exchange consumed infantry battalions and left the slopes cratered and treeless. The earth churned into a moonscape of overlapping shell holes where nothing could survive exposure for more than seconds. Soldiers on both sides learned to move only at night, to dig constantly, to accept that survival was measured in hours rather than days. The elevation that commanded such critical observation became worthless for observation. The smoke and dust of continuous bombardment reduced visibility to meters. While the fighting raged around Hill 200, General Georgy Zhukov arrived at Western Front headquarters to assume direct command of expanded offensive operations. The tactical deadlock on the bloodied elevations gave way to operational planning on a larger scale. Zhukov's staff spread maps across tables showing the entire Rzhev-Sychevka corridor. 2 Soviet armies, 20th and 31st, stood ready for coordinated assault. The objective lay 30 kilometers west, Sychevka, a critical rail junction feeding German forces throughout the salient. Severing this line would isolate 3 German divisions and potentially collapse the entire position. On August 4th, the offensive began. Soviet artillery preparation pounded German positions for 90 minutes. Infantry battalions surged forward behind rolling barrages. By nightfall, the 20th Army had advanced 6 kilometers, reaching the Vazuza River's eastern approaches. By August 5th, lead elements forced crossings over the Vazuza. Engineers constructed pontoon bridges under sporadic artillery fire. A bridgehead formed on the western bank, shallow but secured. The penetration, if reinforced and expanded, could reach the rail line within 48 hours. On August 7th, Soviet armor columns rolled westward from the Vazuza bridgehead. T-34 mediums and KV-1 heavy tanks advanced in staggered echelons, their treads grinding through sandy soil. Dust plumes rose behind the advancing columns, visible to Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights circling at altitude. By midday, lead Soviet tank battalions reached the Gzhatsk-Sychevka rail line itself. Reconnaissance elements reported locomotive movements along the tracks. Supply trains hauling ammunition, rations, and replacement personnel to forward divisions. The breakthrough had achieved its tactical objective. The 350,000 Axis troops holding the Rzhev sector depended on this transportation corridor for survival. The German 6th Panzer Division, which had begun its road march from reserve positions on August 6th, deployed into blocking positions astride the rail line that evening. The Armored Relief Force established a defensive screen with Panzer IV AUSFG tanks equipped with a long 75mm gun. These vehicles positioned hull down along reverse slopes, their frontal armor angled to maximize protection. Supporting elements emplaced 88mm flak guns in anti-tank rolls. The collision of forces transformed the breakthrough from a localized crossing into a direct threat to German defensive cohesion. Soviet 20th Army had bridged the Vazuza, penetrated 30 kilometers, and reached critical infrastructure. But Model was not present. He remained on convalescent leave, recovering from exhaustion accumulated over months of continuous defensive operations. His absence removed the commander, most familiar with the salient's architecture at precisely the moment that architecture faced its greatest test. Walter Model arrived at 9th Army headquarters on August 8th, returning from convalescent leave to find Soviet armor astride the rail line sustaining his entire command. His first orders restructured the improvised German response into coherent defense. Reconnaissance indicated Soviet forces maintained their position along the tracks, but had not yet exploited the breakthrough laterally. Model identified this operational pause as the critical window. He directed elements of 1st, 2nd, and 5th Panzer divisions, units scattered across the salient responding to earlier Soviet probes, to converge on coordinates flanking the penetration point. The counterattack would strike the exposed shoulders of the Soviet advance rather than its reinforced spearhead. At 0347 hours on August 9th, German tank commanders along the rail line initiated cold start procedures. Panzer IV crews hand-cranked inertia starters in the pre-dawn darkness. Each vehicle carried 39 rounds of 75mm ammunition loaded specifically for penetrating T-34 frontal armor. At 0521 hours, with sufficient ambient light for optical range-finding, the counterattack commenced. 73 panzers advanced in company-strength formations, turrets oriented towards Soviet positions across the tracks. The engagement devolved into direct fire exchange at progressively closing ranges. German 88mm batteries provided overwatch from elevated positions, their rounds punching through T-34 turret rings and hull sponsons. Soviet tankers responded with immediate counterfire, the 76mm guns of the T-34 seeking targets through the smoke and dust. By 0847 hours, both formations had sustained catastrophic losses. 17 German panzers burned along the forward slope. Soviet casualties included 23 T-34s and 11 KV-1 heavy tanks, immobilized or destroyed within visual range of the rails. The counterattack achieved tactical disruption of the Soviet breakthrough, but exhausted the armored reserve Model had assembled. Neither force possessed sufficient mechanical strength to exploit success. The rail line remained contested, both armies reduced to attritional exchanges across a battlefield littered with 31 destroyed armored vehicles per linear kilometer of front. With the armored offensive stalled, the fighting shifted to Rzhev's suburban periphery. Soviet infantry of the 30th and 31st Armies advanced from the stalled tank battles into residential blocks and light industrial structures where German defenders had prepared interlocking fields of fire. The transition was immediate, from open terrain littered with burned-out tank hulls to urban combat where engagement distances collapsed to meters. The fortified zone awaiting them was no hastily assembled position. Wehrmacht engineers had spent months preparing Rzhev's defenses. Trenches connected reinforced basements. Machine gun nests occupied second-story windows with clear sightlines down approach streets. The 256th Infantry Division, reconstituted after its mauling on July 31st, had transformed the city's outskirts into a defensive matrix designed to bleed attacking formations through measured attrition. The fighting that unfolded from August 10th to 30th bore no resemblance to mobile warfare. Soviet infantry advanced building by building, often supported by direct-fire artillery pieces wheeled into point-blank range. German 88mm guns pivoted to horizontal trajectories, firing high-explosive rounds through masonry walls. Alexander Karp, a Soviet soldier who endured this fighting, described existence reduced to subterranean survival. "We live like moles in the earth. The walls are made of planks. It's just a bit uncomfortable when there is a lot of noise." On August 21st, after 11 days of continuous pressure, the 30th Army achieved immeasurable advance, the capture of the first trench line in Rzhev's suburbs. The 256th Infantry Division withdrew to secondary positions, yielding ground measured in hundreds of meters. By August 23rd, the first Rzhev-Sychevka offensive officially concluded. Soviet irrecoverable losses reached 57,968 men. The salient remained intact. Zhukov transferred south to the developing crisis at Stalingrad. Ivan Konev assumed control of the Rzhev sector, inheriting a battle that had devolved into positional warfare reminiscent of the Western Front 25 years earlier. In late October 1942, staff officers of the Western and Kalinin fronts gathered to plan Operation Mars, the largest Soviet offensive yet committed to eliminating Model's salient. The numbers were staggering: 817,000 men, 2,352 tanks. The assault force would dwarf every previous attempt. The operational scheme assigned primary objectives to the Kalinin front, with the 22nd and 41st Armies executing coordinated thrusts toward Belai, a road junction 30 kilometers west of the salient's anchor point. On November 25th, the offensive launched. Artillery preparation began at 0730 hours. At 0845, lead battalions surged forward through frozen marshland. The scale of Operation Mars reflected Soviet industrial recovery and manpower mobilization. Artillery tubes arrayed hub to hub along jump-off positions, armor concentrations exceeding anything previously committed to this sector. Model's reserves struck the Soviet spearheads within hours. The 9th Army commander had positioned multiple Kampfgruppen behind the front line, screening routes toward Belai. When reconnaissance reported Soviet armor moving through the marshland approaches, German counterattack formations rolled forward from assembly areas, supported by pre-sighted artillery concentrations that transformed frozen creek beds into kill zones. KV-1 heavy tanks found their 52-ton mass a liability on ground that offered no firm roads. The heavy armor that made them nearly invulnerable to German anti-tank fire became their doom when they bogged in the frozen marshland, unable to maneuver, sitting targets for German guns that could engage at leisure. Panzer IVs engaged from hull-down positions along ridgelines, forcing the heavier Soviet machines into exposed approaches where concealed 88mm guns could target their vulnerable track assemblies and drive sprockets. The Il-2 Sturmovik ground attack aircraft returned in successive waves, their 23mm cannons and rocket salvos targeting German positions. Soviet pilots maintained their attack runs despite losses that would have grounded Western air forces, but concentrated flak imposed severe attrition. The ground attack aircraft could not suppress the interlocking defensive network Model had constructed over months of preparation. The defensive architecture proved impervious to frontal assault. Every approach route had been studied, every likely concentration area pre-registered for artillery. Model had transformed the Rzhev salient into a killing ground where Soviet numerical superiority translated only into higher Soviet casualties. By December 11th, the offensive had consumed 16 days and achieved penetrations measured in kilometers rather than the operational breakthrough required. The 1st Guards Cavalry Corps, encircled deep in German-held territory, represented the offensive's deepest and most exposed success. The Corps commander ordered a breakout attempt as ammunition stocks depleted. The 33rd Army launched a relief effort, but Model's counterattack groups had sealed the penetration routes. On December 20th, Moscow acknowledged reality. Operation Mars officially concluded. Soviet losses: 100,000 dead, 1,700 tanks destroyed. The Rzhev salient remained in German hands. In late February 1943, German staff officers gathered around situation maps at Army Group Center headquarters. Their focus was no longer on holding the Rzhev salient, but on abandoning it entirely. The strategic landscape had transformed. The 6th Army's destruction at Stalingrad had eliminated 30 divisions. Soviet offensives threatened to unhinge the entire southern front. The salient that had consumed men and materiel for 16 months now tied down 17 German divisions that could decide battles elsewhere. Operation Buffalo, would evacuate the position Model had defended for over a year. The withdrawal commenced in early March. German units disengaged from positions they had fortified through 2 winters, abandoning trenches where they had repelled attacks by 817,000 Soviet troops in November alone. Engineers demolished bridges, rail lines, and infrastructure throughout the salient. Combat formations established successive defensive lines to screen the evacuation. On March 31, 1943, Red Army units reoccupied Rzhev's ruins. They found no city. Every building bore marks of systematic demolition. The center that once housed 56,000 residents contained no intact structures. Bridges lay twisted in the Volga below. Water mains were destroyed. The rail station, the strategic objective that had anchored German defense for 20 months, consisted of foundation stones and scattered track sections. The soldiers encountered no civilians. The German occupation had either evacuated or killed Rzhev's population. The liberators found a necropolis, not a city. The final accounting proved grimly simple. German casualties, 670,000. Soviet losses, over 1,100,000. Combined, more than 1.7 million soldiers fell in a sector barely 60 miles wide over 14 months. The 215th Rifle Division that fought house to house through Rzhev streets in September 1942 withdrew when the offensive collapsed, survivors representing a fraction of the original force. Operation Mars committed 817,000 troops and lost 100,000 dead in 25 days. Entire divisions required complete reconstitution. German battalions that entered the salient at 500 men exited at 13. And in the end, the Germans withdrew voluntarily. The salient that Soviet forces could not take was abandoned because holding it no longer served strategic purpose. The divisions that defended it moved south toward Kursk, where the Wehrmacht would attempt one final strategic offensive. The dagger that had pointed at Moscow for 14 months was removed not by Soviet assault, but by German calculation, leaving only ruins and the ghosts of armies that had fought for ground now rendered worthless. The meat grinder had finally stopped. But by then, it had consumed nearly 2 million men and changed nothing. For decades after the war, Soviet authorities suppressed discussion of Rzhev. The battle contradicted the official narrative of inevitable victory through superior strategy. Veterans who survived were discouraged from sharing their experiences. Operation Mars, the catastrophic November offensive, was omitted from official histories entirely, as if 817,000 men and 1,700 tanks had simply vanished into the marshes northwest of Moscow. The Germans remembered Rzhev differently. Model's reputation as the Wehrmacht's foremost defensive specialist was forged in these frozen forests. He would carry those lessons to other desperate sectors, to the Western Front in 1944, where he would command the defense against Allied forces in the war's final months. But the true lesson of Rzhev may be simpler and more brutal. Sometimes battles are fought not for strategic objectives, but because neither side can afford to stop fighting. The salient existed because the Germans had failed to take Moscow. The Soviets attacked because they could not tolerate a German position threatening their capital. The Germans defended because abandoning ground meant acknowledging weakness. And so nearly 2 million men died fighting over terrain that both sides would eventually abandon. The Rzhev meat grinder teaches us that wars are not always decided by decisive battles. Sometimes they are decided by the slow exhaustion of armies fighting for objectives that no longer matter. 1.7 million casualties, 14 months of continuous combat, and in the end, nothing but ruins and graves. That is the story of Rzhev. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching.